I had worked at the Bidacre Manor for about 5 years. A lot of people in town circulated rumors about the manor, about the massacre that happened there, and, of course, the hauntings. A couple of local historians from my town asked me to write down my experiences and talk about what it's like to work at the manor. As a full-time butler and cook, I certainly got to know the corridors and rooms well, though even I never discovered all the secret passageways in that old building. From the front, the manor looked imposing. Thin Victorian turrets with windows spiraling up towered over the ancient evergreen forest surrounding the walls. The front of the manor had the cast of a skeletal face with 2 large, circular windows that looked like staring eyes and many massive round white pillars on the front porch that looked like teeth. It had a disconcerting effect on many visitors who saw it for the first time, and yet the inside of the manor held far more surprises in store. The Bidacre family had passed it down from generation to generation for over 200 years, and they had grown increasingly bizarre and reclusive over time. I worked directly for the patriarch of the family, Alexander Bidacre, who often had delusions about microphones being planted in the trees and bushes and who constantly talked about secret tunnels running under the house. "You know, I think the government has people in the tunnels who come up here when I'm sleeping at night," Alexander told me, his blue eyes wide. He gave off an anxious energy like a child speaking of monsters under the bed. Locks of dirty blonde hair fell over his forehead. His face looked similar to statues of Julius Caesar I had seen, with a straight, aristocratic nose, a small mouth and naturally wavy hair. "It is as you say, sir," I said, bowing respectfully. I knew not to get into it with Alexander. We stood in the courtyard, next to the marble fountain. Up in a window on the 3rd floor, I saw a pale, skeletal face looking out. I only glimpsed it for a moment, but there was no one else in the house besides Alexander and me. This had become a regular occurrence that I learned to ignore over time. "They move everything around," Alexander continued, his small mouth forming into a scowl. His eyes narrowed. "They keep switching all the spoons and knives in the drawers and mixing up all my boxers with my socks. I don't get why they're targeting me," he swore, shaking his fist. "I think it's the goddamn Freemasons. Perhaps you should consider getting some cameras, sir," I said, thinking to myself what a lunatic this man was. He often locked himself in the mansion for months, drinking himself into a stupor in the library every night and fighting with imaginary demons. That the pay was good, over $70,000 a year before taxes, and the work was easy, so I didn't complain too much. And, in a very real sense, I liked Alexander. He was a nut, but he was a harmless rich nut, and there were, I knew, far worse things in life than that, such as homelessness, unemployment, and constant gnawing hunger. I had experienced them enough times before growing up to know, but there was something about the house. Alexander was absolutely right about that. I don't know if they rearranged the silverware or not, but I would catch glimpses of pale, white faces out of the corner of my eye on a regular basis. Sometimes they would be peeking around the corner of a hallway or peering out of a dark room. They always seemed to be grinning, showing off their black eyes and bone-white skin, and whenever I turned to look, they had always vanished. At times, I wondered whether I was also losing my mind, just like poor Alexander. Maybe the house had some black mold that slowly drove everyone living and working there insane. Maybe it had lead and mercury in the water, and we were just becoming mad as haters from an easily explainable, scientific cause. Perhaps there was nothing supernatural about the Bidacre Manor at all. I did suffer many other things than the hallucinations, if that's what they were. I would have trouble sleeping, sometimes staying awake, for 3 or 4 days at a stretch. A kind of manic energy would possess me, and I would pace and listen for noises in the ancient, sprawling mansion. I would pace and listen and they would come. I would hear whispering, and sometimes the creaking of floorboards as small feet passed down the hallway, but I could never catch the intruders in the act. Alexander became increasingly mentally unbalanced as well, and every time he passed me in the halls, he would be clutching a bottle of cognac or gin to his chest, praying to himself, and refusing to meet my eyes. We talked less and less, except over meals. The final straw came when the smells started to pass through the place. Odors like rotting meat and blood would fill up certain rooms or hallways, passing through the entire mansion from one side to the other. Sometimes I would hear something in the vents, and they would rattle and shake. The the metal quivering with quick, uneasy vibrations. I stayed up all night, watching the vents. I shined a flashlight into one, and I caught a glimpse of stringy black hairs with something fetid and dark dripping off the ends, a thick mask of hairs that hung over a grinning, decomposing face. Then, in a blur, it vanished. The vents shook in their casings as the cracking of bones and the quick, rhythmic clicking of skeletal hands on metal faded off into the distance. I couldn't sleep after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that barely glimpsed face. Something about it seemed familiar. It was in the cold, dead eyes and the high cheekbones. As I thought about it, it came to me. It reminded me of my own face. The straight black hair that hung down to the ears, the dark brown eyes, the light skin, and especially the facial structure all reminded me of myself. That is, it looked like myself if I were a walking corpse, set out to desiccate and decompose for a few days. The vents kept shaking until dawn. Alexander and I sat down at breakfast together that morning. Both of us had dark bags under our eyes, and I knew Alexander slept less and less lately. I could hear his manic pacing in the halls at night, and I would catch glimpses of what he whispered to himself. The night before, he had recited a poem as he slowly staggered past my bedroom door. I wrote it down for posterity's sake, at least as much as I heard. We dance and fold in the freezing cold, naked and alive for the first time. Under a black god's eye, we're told to live within this world of grime. The command comes from him, going deep, to cut their throats while they're asleep. The dust gathers, black clouds high above. It's the one we're under the thumb of. The tall, skeletal face, regal and great. The god of the meadows who decides our fate. The dust blows like ashes from a crematorium. The servants gather in the ancient praetorium. The meadow's silver streams are filled with mercury. They dance and cut their throats. Under a black god's thumb. That great one, the ancient torturer, the bone man and king. Its power now in full swing. Over breakfast, we talked about the news and the stock market for a few minutes. A bit of normalcy in a reality that felt more and more like a madhouse. The smell of Boston blew in through the open windows, carried on the wind for miles. I could smell car exhaust, pollution and smoke, the typical hallmarks of a modern city. The dining hall where we sat had bay windows looking out onto the hedgerow maze, an outdoor swimming pool. Ancient purple curtains the color of old bruises gave the massive room a dull pallor. Cabinets filled with antiques and silver cookware lined the back wall. I'm thinking it's time we looked for an extra hand around here, I said. Alexander looked at me blankly. Why? He asked simply. I shifted nervously. It's a big place, and it's hard to maintain the interior by myself, in addition to all my other duties. I know we have landscapers for the outside maintenance now, but so what's the person going to do? He asked. Well, on my days off or when I take vacation, they'll make sure your meals are prepared, and you are properly cared for, of course. They can do any cleaning, maintenance, cooking or driving you need. They could also run errands for us. I have a person in mind. If you are agreeable, I responded. He swallowed his entire burning cup of coffee in one long swallow, then turned and regarded me with his icy blue eyes. What's wrong with temps? He asked. That's what we have always done before when you had vacations or anything. Whenever we need help, we just hire a temp, and then when we don't need them, we get rid of them. I think training a rotating line of new people is somewhat unnecessary and time-consuming, I said. It probably costs us more money in the long term. Plus my sister is looking for a job, and... Your sister? He asked, sitting straight up in his chair. Oh, you should have just led with that. Of course she can work here as long as she doesn't have any violent felonies or anything. I don't want anyone dangerous in this house. I almost laughed at that. The house itself contained more danger than any one person could ever bring in. Obviously she's not a felon or a serial killer or anything, at least that I know of. I paused for a long moment after this, and he laughed, a small, chortling sound that reminded me of Santa. But yeah, she's had a real rough patch. Her baby, a little boy, died from SIDS a few months ago. They found him in the crib, and then her husband left her. I said. Alexander rose from his chair. Okay, bring her down. I'll meet her and we'll go from there. He turned to leave, but he gave me a quick backwards glance. She's not a Freemason or anything, right? A member of the Illuminati, he whispered in a voice choked with terror. Absolutely not, I assured him, pulling out my phone and dialing her number. Jessie, my sister said, answering the phone. Her voice sounded slow and tired, likely much like my own. Long time, no see, huh? Catherine, I said, hi, are you busy right now? Well, I'm unemployed, single and childless, so technically no, she said sardonically, a self-deprecating tone underlying her words. And you still live in Quincy? I asked. Quincy was not too far from the Bidacre Manor, about 15 minutes from Boston. Yeah, until I get evicted, she said sulkily, unless I can find a job immediately. Actually, that's why I'm calling, I said. I have a place for you to stay and a job. Alexander Bidacre said he will hire you full-time if you want. The line went silent for a long moment. I'll start packing right now, she said. Catherine and I got to the Bidacre Manor sometime around dark. My little sedan was filled to the brim with her belongings. Everything seemed slow and the lights seemed too bright. I think the sleep deprivation had begun to affect me more than I knew. I felt like I was passing through water as I got out of the car. Bone tired, I could only think of my soft bed. But Catherine wanted to talk, and she had many questions as we carried her luggage inside. She especially wanted to know about the murders. I sighed, knowing this would turn into a long conversation. Has Alexander ever told you what happened to his grandparents and parents? She asked. I heard a bunch of people died in this house, and not a natural death either. No, I think it was likely the most unnatural death imaginable, I said. They suffered the torments of hell before they died, and Alexander saw it as a child. That's why he's a little off, I think. I mean, for what he went through, he is actually fairly sane. So what really happened to the family? She asked. Do you even know? I nodded grimly. I've heard the story, I said. I wish I hadn't, but I did. It had started, Alexander said, with a popping noise, like a bottle of champagne flung open during a crazy celebration. He had been no more than a small child at the time, 5 or 6. He had heard the popping and then the screaming. He came out of his room and walked the great halls of the manor, going down the massive front staircase, all polished oak and mahogany, and out the front door. He said the world outside was gone. Nothing but blackness stood there, as if the house had teleported into outer space. Stretching out in front of him, he saw an empty eternity that seemed to surround and eat reality itself. A void that seemed to have an insane, reptilian presence all of its own. He felt as if millions of invisible eyes swarmed around him, looking out from the blackness. He ran back to the house in terror, and that was when the nightmare truly began. His grandmother ran out of the dining room, covered in blood and gasping. Deep slices ran down her back and neck, and she tried to keep the spurting wound on her neck from bleeding her dry with sustained pressure. She kept her small, aristocratic hand pressed hard against it, but the blood ran through her fingers like water through a sieve, soaking her and the floor in a waterfall of crimson. His grandfather ran out with a dripping butcher's knife in one hand, his eyes wide and gleaming with a fanatical lust. His old body sprinted forwards, now as fast and sleek as the hounds of hell. He laughed as he went, and the boy could tell his grandfather was not himself, that the man he knew was gone, replaced by something incomprehensible. Only a core of bloodlust and lunacy remained, working through the body like a ventriloquist controlling a puppet. You bitch, he screamed in a trembling voice. I know what you did. You'll pay for this. Please, Jack, stop. His grandmother cried as the knife came down one last time, piercing through her right eye and into her brain. She went still, then her body crumpled to the floor, her legs and arms shaking as if she were seizing. The vitreous fluid from her eyeball mixed with the rivulets of blood that ran down her pale, bloody cheek, and then she stopped moving, her death gasps coming out harsh and discordant. As the muscles on her face relaxed, Alexander stood there, still as a statue. He had wet his pants, he didn't know when, and now he looked down at the puddle of urine that pooled on the floor below him. He wondered where his mother was, his mother who had always loved and protected him. He wondered if the blackness outside would ever recede, would ever let them go, and return the house back to the world he had come from. In a blind panic, he ran from that room, his pants soaking wet and tears streaming from his eyes. With blurry vision, he went into the kitchen and found his father there, laid on the table, moaning and whimpering. Around his father's figure, he saw black creatures, humanoid figures with thin shadow appendages. Long and black like the legs of a spider, their joints twisted in unnatural ways, they hovered over over his father's body with their spiked, vampiric fingers. They removed his father's skin piece by piece. He saw they had already finished the face, which was now just a mask of gore, the lidless eyes bulging over bloody contracting muscles, the teeth chattering in agony. They started slicing into the neck, pulling with care as if removing a priceless painting from a canvas. His father groaned and tried to rise, but spidery black hands pushed him back down, rubbing his skin as a lover would. Alexander felt a slight tickling on his neck, as if some spider had crawled down his shirt. He spun around, seeing more of those black, hovering figures looming over him. They looked down with featureless faces, masks that seemed to be the essence of the void itself. They each hissed, speaking to each other in some snake-like language. The cumulative effect was like a den of vipers, and the hissing became all he could hear. His grandfather ran into the room. Black shadow creatures flitted around him, nearly matching his every movement, but always lagging or jumping forward slightly. With frantic, lunatic eyes, his grandfather screamed. It sounded inhuman, like the death cry of some exotic predator. As he screamed, the black shadow creatures writhed and slithered out of his body. After a few seconds, he slumped, looking fully his own again. He raised his head, staring at Alexander with bloodshot, horror-stricken eyes. "Was it a dream, do you think?" he asked in a quavering old man's voice. "Do you think it was all just a dream, Alexander, my good boy, my sweet boy?" His grandfather turned his head, looking back towards the dining room hallway. He saw his wife's mutilated body sprawled on the ground, a pool of blood spreading out with grasping, liquid fingers all around her. "Oh God," his grandfather said, turning his eyes upwards to the ceiling. "Oh God, forgive me." He raised a knife to his throat. Alexander said time seemed to stop for a moment as his father looked heavenwards, praying. "No, Grandpa, don't do it," he cried, yet too late. With a quick, jerking stab, Alexander watched his grandfather stab the sharp, gleaming knife through one side of his neck and out the other. He collapsed to the floor like a puppet who just had its strings cut. As he died, he looked at Alexander, his eyes still filled with incomprehensible horror and remorse. Alexander ran in a blind panic, heading instinctually back towards the front door. In the massive entrance chamber, with its polished oak stairs and looming mahogany balconies, he saw the final and worst of the terrors. His mother lay crucified against the far wall, her writhing, moaning figure 20 feet above the ground. Thick, rusted nails pierced her wrists and ankles, biting through the bone and digging deep into the wall behind her. All across the wall, the black shadow creatures danced and shimmered, slithering up and down it like salamanders. Her stomach had been cut wide open, and her intestines hung down, uncoiling from her body. They shined pink and red, streaming down below her like ivy or the leaves of a weeping willow, blowing gently with the breeze. "Run, baby," she gurgled through a mouthful of blood that overflowed from her mouth and dripped onto the floor far below her. Her head drooped, yet her eyes continued to stare intently at Alexander. "Run." The shadow creatures stopped all at once, and though they had no eyes, he felt their gazes turning to look at him. Dozens of them glistened like an obsidian void, and the claws on their fingers looked as sharp as broken glass. So he ran out the door as if demons from hell were chasing him, which, perhaps, they were. He felt cold, spongy hands grabbing at him, and claws raked his back, slicing deep into his clothes and skin. The black abyss still stood there, like a sheet of infinite space sliced around the perimeter of the mansion. Yet when he ran, his feet hit something. It wasn't concrete or grass or anything that he knew. It was strange and had a lot of give, like walking on a trampoline. But he didn't stop, instead sprinting out as far into that void as he could go. At a certain point, after what felt like an eternity of crossing this endless void, he heard a popping noise, and then a whooshing sound started all around him. The streets and lights and houses phased back into view, at first staticky and translucent, but then solidifying rapidly. He turned around and saw he had left the border of the Bidacre property and now stood on the street. It was the moment he had crossed over when the world had started to return, and as a little boy, crying and traumatized and covered in urine, he went to the neighbor's house and shrieked until the police arrived, and discovered the gruesome truth of Bidacre Manor firsthand. "Oh my God," my sister said, horrified by the story. "First of all, there's no way any of that's true. Second of all, even if it was true, why would he still live there?" "Well, that's the story he told me, and he never changes an iota of it," I said. "Usually liars tend to embellish stories over time. I mean, obviously, it sounds crazy, but you haven't lived in that house. I have. It's not normal. Something inside of it is alive or aware in some way." And I asked him the same question you did. Why would anyone still live in that house after what he had been through. But you know what Alexander said, and I think I understand. He said he can't leave. He said he tried, but whenever he did, the place he lived would immediately have some sort of issue. He bought a mansion in Connecticut, and it burned down after a week. He bought one in Florida, and it got caught in a sinkhole. Imagine the chances of that. Anyways, he says the house reaches out to him when he tries to leave, and I think he's right. He says the fires and sinkholes aren't just bad luck, but the black shadow creatures swarming him every time he tries to leave. They create bad luck and death somehow, and whenever he tries to leave, things began to go horribly wrong. He ended up in a mental institution for 3 months last time, and he has lived here ever since. He says that even though this place is nightmarish and haunted, it somehow gives him energy and clarity when he's inside. He said that the voices are a lot quieter in here than when he's outside. We turned onto the private road leading to Bidacre Manor, winding through acres of wooded fields. The trees around the manor always seemed to look strange to me, like claws reaching up into the sky. Many of them were dead and leafless, even in the hot summer months, and animals didn't seem to do well around here. We would find the corpses of coyotes and even bobcats scattered around the bare trees, or entangled in the thick brush off the side of the road on a regular basis. I pulled the car into the front of the house, parking in front of a statue of the Archangel Michael, wielding a sword, his wings unfurled behind him as he stood as straight and proud as a soldier. Catherine immediately got out, grabbing some of her suitcases. "I'm exhausted," she said. "I'm going to bed. Can you show me where I'll be staying?" I pointed to an empty doghouse in the backyard, barely visible from the glow streaming from the windows of the manor. She laughed. "Sure, you first." I got out, a sudden burst of energy coming over me as I felt the cool autumn breeze blowing over my skin. I looked up at the house, and from the top floor, I saw faces peering out of every single window. "Do you see?" I asked Catherine, pointing, but by the time she had turned her head, the silhouettes had disappeared from the windows. "What?" she asked, confused. "The house. Yeah, it's pretty cool looking, you're right. I like all the statues and turrets, and the Victorian windows. This was built back when they made houses to last." "Yeah, and they also filled them with asbestos and lead paint probably," I said. "Well, you gotta cut costs somewhere," she said, grinning, and I laughed. Yet the faces I had seen in the windows still gave me a creeping sensation, like ice dripping down my spine. I remembered how the vents had shook, and how I had seen that face, my own face rotten and grinning through the metal slats. I showed Catherine to her room. She gave an exclamation of wonder at the beauty of the front chamber as we strode up the sweeping, polished stairs. "They're so wide you could drive 3 cars down them. It's like the size of a highway," she exclaimed. She looked at the ornately carved banisters and balconies overhead. In some places, huge gargoyles with twisted faces looked down, their bodies fused into the house itself. Out of large, carved pieces of mahogany, artisans had carved the gargoyles scattered throughout the house, their bodies muscular and reptilian with each individual scale hewn into their hides by hand. "They're supposed to protect the house from evil spirits," I whispered confidentially. "Alexander thinks they work." After the incident, he brought in professional sculptors and had them add these to the home. "The placebo effect is a powerful thing," Catherine exclaimed in a scholarly tone. "Yeah, well, I don't know anything about that, but the house has calmed down over the last few years. It used to be worse. I used to wake up in the middle of the night and see people standing over my bed. They wore black robes and their faces looked like they had mostly rotted away. They spoke to me with a voice like the cracking of falling rocks, and the stench of decomposing meat would linger in my room for days afterward. At first, I thought it was sleep paralysis, but after a while, they'd say things like, 'The Black God's minions rise in the secret chamber,' and 'The Bidacre blood will spill to cleanse these walls, and you shall all die with him.'" "Secret chamber?" Catherine asked, perking up. I nodded. "Yeah, there's all sorts of hidden tunnels and secret rooms in this place. I found a couple by accident, but I don't go looking for them, and I definitely don't go exploring them. This place was built in the 1700s and half of those tunnels could have already collapsed." "Well, that's you," she said, her eyes glinting with excitement. "After I get settled in and sleep, I'm going to have a look around." "Good for you," I said. "You start work tomorrow at 7:30 in the morning. Mr. Bidacre likes slab bacon, eggs, French toast, and coffee for breakfast, by the way." She nodded, that gleam of adventure still marking her face. "Okay, good night." I turned and left, going to my room and falling quickly asleep. "Jesse," someone said softly. A small hand gently tapped my shoulder. "Jesse, you awake?" I sat up in bed, looking around in the near total dark. "Get back, fiend," I said fiercely, taking my silver cross necklace off my head and shoving it towards the sides of the bed. "Back, I say." No, it's me, Catherine," a diffident voice said. I sagged, leaning over and flicking on the lamp. "What the hell are you doing walking around in the pitch black?" I asked. "And what time is it?" "Look, it's 3 in the morning, but that doesn't matter. I found something," she exclaimed triumphantly. I sighed, pulling on a long-sleeved shirt as I got out of my warm bed. "Fine," I said groggily, slipping my shoes on. "I'll check it out. But this better be really cool if you're waking me up in the middle of the night." "Oh, it is," she said with a sly grin and a wink. "It is." I followed her downstairs into the library. I saw Alexander had slept in his own bed tonight, rather than posting an all-night vigil by the books and liquor cabinet. I saw a shot glass with a small amount of liquid next to a bottle of gin and some tonic and juice. "Gross, gin," Catherine said, gagging. "How does anyone drink that crap? It is so freaking gross." "Is this, what you wanted to show me?" I asked tiredly, rubbing my eyes. She laughed. No, that's over here," she said, moving towards the dark fireplace in the center of the far wall. It was swept clean. No one had built a fire here in years, maybe even decades. The house, after all, had central heating, and the fireplaces simply remained as remnants from a more primitive time. The gray stone swept up in an arch over the fireplace, and a large mirror hung there. A statue that appeared Mayan stood on the ledge, next to other ancient trinkets that had stayed there for God knows how long. Centuries, perhaps. The statue had a creature with fangs and bulging eyes, with a snake coiled loosely around its arms and neck. It had big, naked feet sticking out, and a strange, pyramid-like hat with countless runes and symbols carved into it towering over its head. "Check this out," Catherine said, reaching out and grabbing the Mayan statue by the top. She pulled it forward, slowly and gingerly. She seemed to strain for a moment, taking both hands. With a heaving gasp, she pulled the statue forwards a fraction of an inch. Behind the walls, I heard rolling and clicking and sliding as gears started to work. The fireplace opened in front of us like a party mouth. Below, I saw dusty stone stairs leading down into the dark. "I'll go get a flashlight," Catherine said, running gleefully back to her room. I groaned, waiting there. I thought I saw movement at the bottom of the stairs, as if a lighter-colored patch of shadows had flitted through the darkness, but I couldn't make it out. I heard light steps below, and I wondered if it was rodents or something worse. "Okay, I have 2, Catherine said excitedly, running into the room behind us. I jumped as her voice rang out behind me, knocking me out of my reverie. She shined the light down into the tunnels, and of course, no one was there. I could have sworn I saw something, I whispered, more to myself than to her. She ignored the comment. "I'll go first," she said, beaming, looking as thrilled as a kid on a school field trip. "Catherine, I kinda have a bad feeling about this, and I really don't think you should," I began, but she had already started down the stairs. I sighed, following close behind. We found an ancient den of nightmares at the bottom. The first thing I saw when I shined my light into the chamber deep under the house was an Iron Maiden, the metal rusted, the bloodstains black under the bright glare of the LED flashlight. Then I saw all the skeletons. They had long ago had all the meat stripped off their bodies by roving bands of rats and flies, and now they laid on the ground, their dried bones a muddy yellow. Catherine began to walk around, and soon, on a counter covered with soiled torture tools, she found a journal. I looked in horror at the pliers, the knives, the grinders, the pullers and twisters, all covered in ancient, dark blood. She began to read. According to this, she said slowly, the excitement having gone out of her eyes, these were slaves. The original Bittaker patriarch who built this house, Jefferson Bittaker, had bizarre tastes. He documented all the tortures and murders he committed here. It looks like he murdered hundreds of slaves. She looked up, disgust marring her features. "Do you think Alexander knows about this?" I shrugged. I had no idea, and honestly, I didn't see how it could possibly matter. This happened a few hundred years ago, I said. Who cares? What are we going to do about it now? Absolutely nothing, that's what. "But don't you think we should contact a historical?" she began, but then I heard the footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Alexander walking down the stone steps with a sawed-off shotgun in his hands. He wavered from side to side, looking extremely drunk. "What in the hell are you two doing down here?" he asked in a gruff voice, squinting his eyes. "This place is cursed. No one should ever open that passageway again. I should have had that goddamn statue removed. I knew it." "What's going on here, Alexander?" I asked. He looked at me with watery eyes, giving me a sad smile. "Today is the 40th anniversary of the death of my parents and grandparents," he said, "and I don't think these bones will stay silent. I don't think it's a coincidence your sister came here and found this passageway tonight, of all nights. I am the last of the Bitacre line, and they want my blood. They won't ever let me rest until they have it, but I'm not going down without a fight." Without warning, he pointed the sawed-off shotgun at the grinning skull of a skeleton laying next to him. The gunshot went off like a cry from God. The shotgun bucked in his hands as he whooped, blowing shards of bone and clods of dirt all over the cold stone chamber. As if in response to the indignity, black streamers began to run down the walls, coiling like snakes as they spread across the ground and began to move towards the prone skeletons scattered all over the floor. I saw dark, cloudy smoke swirling around the leg bones and arm bones, moving to fill in the chest cavity and wrapping around the jaw and spine like a boa constrictor killing an animal. They formed a covering of spongy, dark flesh, and the bodies began to move. Dozens of skeletons, now turned pure black from the writhing and curling of the tendrils, raised their heads and stared at me. That was when I knew the source of the black shadow creatures Alexander had seen. "Oh God, it's starting again," Alexander said as the bodies began to rise, the shadows covering their bones. They looked like black silhouettes now, the void that moved through their bodies animating them with a jerky, skittering quality. With haunted eyes, he turned to look at us. "Run." We didn't look back. Catherine and I peeled out of the room. I heard Alexander at our heels, breathing hard. He nearly stumbled as we made it out of the fireplace. He turned to try to shut the tunnel, moving his hand towards the Mayan statue, but two shadowy figures ran out and knocked him hard to the ground. He kept his grip on the shotgun, raising it from a prone position and shooting both in the heads. Bone splinters rained down on the wall behind them as the shadowy auras flickered and then dissipated, the smoke turning invisible in the moving air within seconds. Two half-destroyed skeletons fell limply to the floor. Catherine and I each grabbed Alexander under a shoulder, heaving him up as more creatures ran through the opening. We sprinted away, heading towards the library and shutting and locking the door behind us. Alexander immediately went to the liquor cabinet, pulling out bottle after bottle of expensive liquor. "This is no time to start drinking," I said, shocked, but then he began to smash each bottle on the ground, covering the floor with shattered glass and the fumes of whiskey, vodka, gin, tequila, and all other manner of booze. "You guys better get out of here," he said in a hopeless, dead voice, pulling a lighter out of his pocket. I saw what he meant to do at the last second. "No," I cried as he knelt down and ignited the alcohol. A blue flame spread across the floor, a sucking, gasping noise following as it rose from one side of the room to the other. I pulled Catherine by her arm, leading her out the servant's door and towards the kitchen. "We have to get out and call for help," I said. "We can't let it happen again." The door exploded open behind us. Alexander came sprinting in, dozens of shadowy figures close at his heels. They came running out of the inferno like the beasts of hell. The fire exploding out of the door licked the ceiling with long tongues of flame as black, choking smoke filled the hall. I saw them overtake Alexander, knocking him down with their long, twisted arms. His shotgun went sliding across the marble floor and under the table, landing near my feet. Their claw-like fingers began to reach down, heading towards his eyes and mouth as he gazed up at them with horror. "Oh God, please, no," he said as one cut out his right eye, ripping off the lid and then digging deep into the socket to cut the connective tissues in the back. The others gathered around. An eerie, echoing susurration of voices began to filter out from the crowd of nightmares that looked down on Alexander like a patient on a surgical table. A few looked up at Catherine and me, their heads rising. Though they had no eyes, I could sense their cold, reptilian stare. I quickly knelt down, feeling under the table for the shotgun. They came at us in a blur. My fingers closed around the cold metal of the gun. I raised it, firing. Their chests exploded as the black smoke kept coming, blowing past me in a cloud as as the shattered bones fell to the floor, and yet others began coming, streaming through the door. I grabbed Catherine's hand and began to push her towards the back. I felt cold claws ripping across my back. A torrent of blood began to stream down and soak my shirt. I spun and began firing, seeing more black clouds evaporate as skeletons fell to the ground. Catherine and I reached the back door. I saw an endless abyss stretching outside, as starless and dead as a black hole. But I remember the story Alexander had told me. "Don't stop," I cried. She closed her eyes and quickly stepped from the threshold out onto the spongy void beyond. Her feet seemed to sink slightly into the ground, as if she were walking on foam. I followed. As we traveled further away from the Bidacre Manor, I looked back to see flames licking the Victorian turrets and white, skeletal faces peering out of every window. We kept walking and suddenly, with a popping sound, the street and houses whooshed back into existence. We looked around, the silence seeming overwhelming after the chaos and bloodshed of the last few minutes. As we waited for ambulances and fire trucks to arrive, after going to the neighbor's house and calling 911, I stood there, watching the manor where I had worked for so many years. It had seemed like home at times, but like many things, it had dark secrets deep in the bowels of its soul. The moonlight streamed down from above. Clouds passed overhead, dark gray like the face of a corpse. And though I couldn't tell for sure, I would have sworn I saw black, twisting shapes rising up into the stars above. Any minute now, they would make their appearance like zombies. Lost souls. Every night, I timed it perfectly. I learned to count time in the white room that held me, that tried to tell me I was crazy for 10 years. I spent every night sitting on a pristine white bed counting. I counted my own breaths, and then sealing tiles and individual grains of rice on my dinner tray. When orderlies told me to keep my voice to myself, I counted in my head instead. I wouldn't lose him to time again. It was always 1 in the morning. Always when the park was going dark, and a razor-sharp chill crept into the air, his name twisting and contorting in my throat. A small congregation of loved ones stood with me. Maybe 5 or 6 people, young and old, all with the same haunted eyes, expressions drowned in pain they were yet to let go of. There was a collective held breath, and my own lungs were stinging from forgetting to breathe, my thoughts dancing. The vibration in my pocket snapped me from fruition, but I didn't let go of my breath. I hadn't fully let it go for 10 years, constantly fighting with my lungs to remember how to fully take in oxygen. 10 years, and I had never truly left the park, not really. Sure, I had been physically removed, dragged kicking and screaming, thrown into a room with 4 walls of white oblivion, and a single ticking clock staring back. Physically, I had left, and through broken mirrors and silver door handles, the curved lenses of my therapist's glasses, I had aged. I was 18 years old, a senior with my whole life ahead of me. 18 years old, I remembered clinging into the exact gates I stood in front of. It was summer, and I remembered the blistering heat prickling on my skin, the security guard's fingernails slicing into the flesh of my sunburned shoulders. Ben was gone. He had been there with me, the 2 of us running for our lives. And then he was gone. It's crazy how 10 years can pass in the blink of an eye. I could still remember my banshee cries, my begging, my phantom screams trapped in 2011, and yet bleeding through into the present day. I was 27 years old. The sky was pitch dark, a half moon casting an eerie glow across the park. The chill was a sharp bite, whipping my ponytail back like the wind itself was telling me what I was doing was a bad idea. I didn't care, wrapping my hands around the cool metal prongs of the towering gate. I was back, 10 years, and I was finally taking him home. 1 a.m. The sharp whispers from the people around me told me it was time. For a disorienting moment, my mind went blank, my thoughts cotton candy. I knew this feeling. I knew the feeling of being unable to breathe, to move, to talk coherently. 1 in the morning had always taken that away from me. I promised myself this time I would not look. My body felt like a dead weight, and I stared at the ground, my heart galloping into my throat. I could hear their shuffling footsteps getting closer and closer, and I squeezed my eyes shut. Lucy, the soft cry turned my gut inside out. When I lifted my head, I saw them, shuffling figures, shadows stretching toward us. I recognized the one in front automatically. Beneath the pale glow of the hanging moon, Elsa looked almost ethereal. The girl's face was pale, glowing underneath the light bathing her. I should have seen Lucy. The woman calling her name was sobbing, pressing her head against the bars. But I just saw Elsa. It was almost unearthly, terrifying, how the girl resembled the Ice Princess, her iconic white blonde braid and flowing blue dress trailing behind her. Elsa wasn't alone. Others joined her, moving in a slow stride, their eyes vacant. Mulan, Jasmine, and then Snow White. After them came the guys. I sucked in a breath, but only Jack Frost and Captain Hook appeared, the two of them stumbling into bleeding shadows. It was their shuffled footsteps that scared me. I didn't know why they came out, but they did. 1 a.m. every night without fail. Severed from phantom strings, they stumbled toward us like hordes of zombies. Instead of blood and gore, however, there were silk dresses, wigs, and flawless skin. Hook was carrying his sword, while Elsa's crown perfectly sat on top of her head. Elsa stopped in her slow stride, her lips stretching into a wide, plastic grin. Others followed. I felt my body tense up, my gut twisting into knots. The way they moved, like puppets dancing on strings, twisted my gut into knots. I liked to pretend part of them was still in there, screaming for a way out. Hook wandered over the furthest end of the gate while Snow White and Jack Frost stood perfectly still, their arms by their sides. I didn't like watching, but I couldn't help it. They were like robots awaiting command, empty shells drained of their souls hanging on puppet strings I couldn't see. The woman calling Elsa's name burst into sobs, reaching out through the metal prongs, trying to reach out. Elsa looked straight through her, still with that unnerving grin. The poor woman's eyes stung my chest. "Lucy, it's Mom," she whispered. "I came back for you. I will always come back for you, baby, every night. Mommy will get you out." The woman's sobs broke my heart, her heaving, strained breath splintering the uneasy silence. Lucy stared straight through her mother, Elsa's grin unwavering. Now that she was closer, I could see why her mother was sobbing, could barely control her gasps for breath, slamming her hand over her mouth. Whoever this Lucy girl was no longer looked human. She looked like Elsa, like she had always been this character, a being not of flesh and blood, but plastic and clay molded and sliced into the picture-perfect princess. Her eyes didn't blink, didn't flicker or move, permanently wide and exhilarated for children's entertainment. Animated. I didn't think a human being could perfect such an expression, and yet she did so effortlessly. Her smile was the copy and paste grin from the movie. I wondered how old she was, how old she really was, because Disney characters don't age, and neither do their skin suits. From the look on Lucy's haggard-looking mother's face, she had been visiting her for a long time. Lucy's mom didn't eat or sleep or think without her daughter crossing her mind. She reminded me of myself, staring at my ghost through the shattered mirror in the white room. Her skin was pallid and pale, eyes sunken and haunted. Still though, she was smiling, her eyes darting back and forth in a frenzy. I knew the girl's mom was looking for it. I was trying to find it too. In all of them, the spark of something, anything, that told us someone, even just an ignition of consciousness, was still in there. But no, the cruel reality was Lucy was dead, and Elsa, Queen of Arendelle, was standing in front of us. The same went for the other kids. Teenagers when they were snatched into the dark, and still teenagers 10 years later, their youth more of a mask for the cruel reality inside. Disney didn't like aging. They wanted to keep the magic. There was nothing human about Lucy, Hook, Snow White, or any of them. Not anymore. Anything that had been them had been cruelly cut and purged, sliced away to make way for a perfectly sized shell. Hook's smile was a permanent smirk showcasing his personality, while Snow's lips were pressed into a thin, patient line. They never came right up to the fence, always staying a certain distance, like the real world was a bad place and Disney was their home. Lucy cocked her head to the side, grinning at an imaginary crowd only she could see. Her eyes fell into oblivion, drinking in nothing, and that same nothing reflecting in her pupils. I think that was why, after failing to get Lucy's attention, her mother turned and walked away, trembling, her hands over her eyes. She did speak, but rather to the ground than her dead daughter's face. "I'll be back tomorrow, my sweet girl," she whispered through the bars. The woman's steps were quickening, her breaths growing labored. "Mommy will be back, okay." There was a hesitance in her voice I don't think even she was expecting. I wondered if the woman was lying to herself. Maybe that night had been the last time she went to see Lucy. Her footsteps bled away, retreating into the night. and I found myself almost alone, a teenage boy standing next to me, hands in pockets, rocking back and forth on his heels. The kid stood out like a sore thumb, as if he'd stepped right out of my memory. At first, I thought I was going mad seeing him mixed in with the small crowd gathered in front of the fence. This kid perfectly captured the essence of the early 2010s with his plaid shirt, skinny jeans, and worn scuffed Converse, pulling me back to my high school days. Yet, despite his outdated style, the kid's face was undeniably that of a teenager from 2020. Odd. He would occasionally lean against the fence, his fingers clenching around the metal bars, frowning at Hook in particular. The boy didn't speak until the sobbing woman's footsteps had faded, leaving the two of us in a strangely comfortable silence. "Hey you," he finally murmured, prompting me to turn toward him. Though young, his face was overshadowed by hollow, haunted eyes that I didn't want to question. His eyes said so much and so little, and yet were somehow aged way beyond his years. His expression was mostly nonchalant, bar-curled lip. A tuft of thick brown hair peeked under a baseball cap. He cocked his head, his gaze flicking back to the characters. "Do you see Pan?" "Pan," I said, without thinking. "Yeah, Peter Pan." I squinted into the dark. The only guys were Frost and Hook. "No," the boy sighed, tipping his head back. "Fuck. This is the third night in a row I haven't seen him." I couldn't stop myself, my tongue tangled with questions. "Are you?" I hesitated. "I mean, are you here for someone?" "Sort of," he hummed. His expression flickered with intrigue, drinking me in. "So are you." I nodded, stepping away from the fence. The kid turned toward the Disney characters still standing motionless, his expression darkening. "My boyfriend." Ouch. His lip twitched. "Which one?" I was so used to sympathy smiles, sympathy eyes that made me want to crawl into the ground. "It's not your fault he's gone," people would tell me, hoping that's exactly what I wanted to hear. I was so tired of fake smiles and wide eyes. So, the kid's nonchalance was a breath of fresh air. "Flynn Rider." I surprised myself by saying his name out loud, which meant for the first time in 10 years, I was no longer in denial. Something in the kid's expression twisted. He turned away from me, focusing on Snow White. "I used to know a Flynn Rider," he hummed. "Back when I was charming, the bastard slaughtered me and kept him." The kid's words were not what I was expecting, immediately taking me off guard. Suddenly, his odd fashion sense was significant. The boy's lip curled, eyes narrowing, like he too was looking for something. It felt like the ground had been ripped from my feet. If this kid was implying what I thought he was implying, then my therapist was wrong. My mom was wrong. Everyone was wrong. It was so cold, and yet warmth was slowly spreading through me, bile making its way up my throat. The boy jumped up and down on his heels. Now, I'm standing here in the freezing cold when I should be home, trying to find his little brat of a brother who just had to get himself caught. I was breathless. Suddenly, "You were one of them." The kid shrugged, pouting. "It's complicated." I couldn't stop myself. "In what way?" I gestured through the gate. "You were one of those things, and you got out." I was aware of my voice rising in pitch, his expression growing progressively darker. He studied me like I was crazy, backing away slightly. I pretended not to see the slight glistening in his cheek, like his skin was made of metal. "Like I said, it's complicated," he said. "They didn't magically decide to let me go." His gaze found the ground. "I was selfish. That's how I got out of there. Selfish." He shot me a sickly smile, and again, there was something about his face that reminded me of the other Disney characters. "Why do you think I'm here tonight?" I made that idiot a promise. I nodded, dizzily, my chest aching. "What was his name?" The kid's eyes softened. "It's not your Flynn," he said. "Trust me, they had multiple on standby." He pointed at himself. "Charming's, however, there was just me." The kid chuckled. Something about his voice aged him far beyond his youthful face. No kid was interested in the old princes. They wanted Flynn and Kristoff. So, they had one model, which, yeah, that was me. I was still waiting for the name, his words going in one ear and out the other. "Roman." He rolled his eyes, giving in. His name was Roman, while their Rapunzel was Maya. Roman, I thought. Not Ben. So, if this kid's friend was Flynn, then what happened to my Flynn? I would describe the feeling as being ripped apart from the inside, being filled with momentary hope, only to have it snatched away, unbridled despair taking hold. just like the day I found him, standing in front of a group of littles, clad in the character's costume, shirt and blue waistcoat, swinging his sword for grinning kids. His smile was too wide, too animated, and this faux prince had my boyfriend's face, his wide brown eyes, the freckle on his nose. Striding over to him, I had shoved the kids out of the way. "Where have you been?" I hissed out, grabbing his arm. He was so cold. "I've been looking for you everywhere. Where did you go?" I couldn't breathe, my heart in my throat. Because Ben and I found the truth behind the people inside Disney costumes. Now, he was working for them, trapped inside a trance I couldn't penetrate. Tugging at the sleeve of his costume, I tried to ignore his vacant eyes and smile that barely acknowledged me. I shoved him and he didn't blink. "Ben," I grabbed his face, cradling cheeks that were so cold, flesh that had hardened into almost a clay-like substance. When I forced him to look at me, his smile unwavered, his grinning laugh. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of light in his pupils that had hollowed out my boyfriend from the inside. Wiping him away, what was left was his face, his frozen, unblinking eyes and too wide smile. When I stumbled away, security was already grabbing hold of me. I was dragged away and thrown inside a white room. I felt like I was losing Ben all over again. I could feel my knees buckling, my body was suddenly too heavy. I knew it. I had always known he was dead, just like Lucy, but I needed to see it for myself. I lost Roman and Maya, the kid continued, his eyes delving into oblivion. Then I got a second chance, and I ran. His voice broke around the words. There it was again, that break in his tone. This kid sounded way older than 18 years old. They gave me a choice. I could either be disposed of properly and ripped from this body, he gestured to himself, or turn in both brothers to the Mad Mouse himself, granting myself freedom and another chance. I had a hard time figuring out what he meant by this body. The kid caught my eye, lips quirking into a smile that was human despite everything else about him being anything but. "I'm Dylan, by the way, kidnapped in 2011 and turned into a fucking doll." That explained his fashion sense. Ignoring his half-hearted salute, I focused on the boy's words. "You were one of those things, and they let you go." "Yep." He avoided my gaze. I was selfish, and I deserved to be fucking selfish. I deserved a second chance. This kid might have been putting on an award-winning performance, but I could see the streaks of vulnerability creasing in his eyes, his body stiffening. 10 years, he said bitterly. I was in there and I was nothing. I couldn't think, or breathe, or taste, or smell. There was nothing, nowhere to escape, and not even a fucking body to kill to end it. He didn't look at me, his shoulders slumping. I had a chance to breathe again, to see a world that had moved on without me. I got to see my dad again, from afar, because he wouldn't believe it was me. I could see my girl, who's grown up and had 2 children with my best friend. I don't have family, anyone to come back to, but I don't care, because I'm alive. The kid swiped at his eyes, his tone hardening. Don't tell me you wouldn't do the same, because you don't know the feeling of being nothing, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, just existing and waiting to fade. Straightening up, he shrugged. So, yeah, I'm selfish and fucking proud. I chose my words very carefully, backing away in one single step. You're still here, I said in a breath, searching his eyes for that light, that spark of nothing that drowned Ben's. They let you go, but you're still here. Why? The guy's lip curled. I told you, I made a promise. To Roman. He nodded. Those bastards took his little bro. Dylan arched his neck, pressing his head against the fence. But I haven't seen him in a while. Last time I saw him was 2 or 3 weeks ago, and even then, he looked kinda. He drifted off, leaning back and focusing on me. There's a back entrance if you want to see your boyfriend. They opened the doors after midnight to do a head count with the higher-ups. Dylan jetted his chin toward Hook and Jack Frost still standing immobile. Hook's grin was unnerving. You can easily get through without being noticed. He twisted to me, but you gotta do me a favor. I found myself nodding, breathless once again at the thought of seeing him again. Even if he wasn't there anymore, even if he had been cruelly scooped out of his body, I needed closure. What do you want me to do? Instead of responding, he helped me get over the gate. I was up and over in a breath, my hand smacking on the concrete. When I jumped up, Elsa was standing several feet away. Being so close to her, I felt sick to my stomach. They're harmless, the kid's voice snapped me out of it, but I was already scanning the dark blanketing me. Jack Frost's arm shifted, Snow White's smile widening. When the two started toward me, I pressed my hand over my mouth to suppress a cry. Dylan wrapped his arms around the steel bars, pressing his head against the other side. Relax, dude, they probably think you're a kid, right? I whispered, my heart slamming into my chest. Where do I go? Under the silvery light of the moon, Dylan's eyes resembled Ben's, that same light ignited in his pupils. There's a door right behind you, he whispered. It'll lead you straight into the underground tunnels, and if you're lucky, you'll find him in the Scarlet Room. His sobering expression told me everything I needed to know. There wouldn't be a happy ending, but I would be getting closure, saying goodbye. I can't say there will be anything left of him. Dylan spoke with sincerity, but it wouldn't hurt to look. Something ice cold slithered down my spine. And what is the favor? His gaze found the ground, hands tightening on the bars. If you see Peter and Wendy, I want you to kill them for me. He didn't wait for me to respond. Trust me, it's a mercy. His eyes found mine, and I saw guilt, an agony I could never understand tightening his jaw. Roman's brother was 16 years old, he said in a hiss. I didn't know him, but Zach did. Roman's little bro was a fucking child, and they took him, just like his brother, and ripped out his soul. Who's Zach? I whispered, phantom crawlies filling my mouth. Dylan looked caught off guard for a moment, undeniable sadness taking hold. Part of me already knew what he was trying to hide. After all, he was an ex-Prince Charming. That is also complicated. Trust me, Zach is a whole other level of complicated that I don't have time to explain. He shook his head. My point is, killing them is saving them. It's setting them free. Before I could start spewing questions I knew I didn't want the answers to, I twisted around and forced myself to walk. Wait, Dylan hissed. What's your name? Cassandra. I didn't turn around. The kid's voice followed me all the way to the door. Are you sure you want to go in there, Cassandra? No, but I didn't say that. Dylan's words were still haunting the back of my mind when I left him, slipping through the open door, allowing me to bleed into the tunnels. Cold. A chill ran up my spine when the door clanged behind me. The same long, widening tunnel I stumbled through 10 years ago stood in front of me, the door from my nightmares that I had drawn on paper, and when my drawing supplies were taken away, I scratched it onto my desk and into my walls. Therapists told me it wasn't real, so I bit all of them. It was real. The prison hidden underneath the park, and the trapdoors snatching away loved ones. Starting forward in a slow stride, I used my phone as a flashlight. 10 years prior, Ben and I wandered down the same tunnel. I remembered his hands entangled in mine, his breath sharp and heavy in an attempt to drag me away from the horror. I had described my experience to so many people, and all of them called me crazy. We found a room full of people, bodies like empty shells lying on metal gurneys. We ran. I thought he was behind me. I thought we had escaped, but he was gone, whisked away into the dark. Ben's disappearance wasn't my fault, they told me. Stop playing make-believe to cope, Cassandra. You are a grown adult and you need to let him go. Mom's voice reverberated in my head as I followed my muscle memory. I remembered everything, the cold, flickering white light barely illuminating the tunnel, and each steel door. I could feel my body starting to register where I was going, my stomach twisting, a thick paste filling my mouth. I remembered a room filled with Disney characters, new and old, pooling red staining metal flooring, and the unmistakable stunk of rot. A sudden giggle echoing down the winding tunnel sent me backing into a door and slipping through the gap. I had to share my eyes, harsh light striking me. It was exactly the same, the room full of Disney characters, but unlike 10 years ago, there weren't half a dozen bodies. Staggering back, I stepped on something fleshy. It was a severed arm, a white shirt sleeve still clinging to mangled flesh. When I turned around, there was a head, and then a torso, bright red hair that reminded me of Ariel. The girl's eyes were still open, the rest of her, the slithery remains of her other half, poked from a pile of clothes. I did throw up, this time, grasping onto my knees and heaving up my dinner. No, not just clothes. Bodies, new and old, heads, limbs, and torsos scattered like doll pieces. I turned to run, to get out of there. This room had only gotten fuller through the years, now a dumping ground for unwanted Disney characters. Swallowing my stomach lining, I dropped onto my knees and crawled over to them before I could stop myself, picking through bones and flesh that was still warm. I didn't think about the real skin, slimy and warm, old bones and new bodies, fresh and still warm. I didn't think about eyes that were still open, still blinking at me, parted lips frozen in a scream. These people were the missing kids who were never found, the forgotten and homeless, the disappeared who nobody questioned. Then, I didn't realize I was sobbing, shrieking into my red slicked hands. He had to be here, I thought hysterically. I found him in a pile, crushed under Anna and Hans, forgotten and left to rot. His costume was glued to his body, one arm was missing, an eye plucked from his socket, and rubber-looking skin, but it was still him. It was Ben. He was still warm, somehow. When I hugged him to my chest, his body twitched. Ben's eye flickered, his expression flickering. "Hi," I whispered. My boyfriend blinked, his lips splitting into a grin, congealed blood welling from his nose. His wide smile didn't waver, stretching across his lips. "You broke my smolder." His head twitched with an uncharacteristic laugh. "Gasm to height. Listen, Blondie." His fingers formed a fist, and then relaxed. "I'll take you to see the lanterns." Not Ben. With my boyfriend still jerking in my arms, my gaze found a thin plank of wood leaning against the wall. Dylan said killing them was saving them, but Ben was still there, still alive and breathing against my chest. He didn't make sense. His body was more of a doll, a shell, congealed blood and missing limbs, but it was still him. I jumped up and pulled him with me, dragging the stumbling boy with me. "You're going to be okay," I managed to get out in a sob, pulling him to the door. Reaching the tunnel, I hurried down the way I'd come, keeping a tight grip around Ben's arm. He didn't speak. His body jerking, a thick reddish sludge dripping down his chin. When I glimpsed a pinprick of light and quickened my pace, that same giggle from earlier brought me to a halt, shivers creeping down my bare arms. She appeared in a blur of blonde curls tied in a baby blue ribbon. I knew who she was automatically. Wendy Darling, dressed in her iconic nightgown when she flew to Neverland. This girl wasn't moving, only standing, giggling at Ben and I. She didn't speak, her empty eyes straight through me, so I turned around and slammed directly into Peter Pan. The lack of light in the tunnel drowned out most of his identity, turning him, ironically, into a shadow. But so close to him, I noticed he was trembling, his head, like Ben's, jerking to the left and then the right. The kid was undeniably Peter Pan, his costume a bright green tunic with jagged edges mimicking leaves, and a pair of matching tights. On his head, the iconic floppy green hat. As my eyes started to adjust to the dark, I could see Peter Pan's all too familiar childish smile and mischievous eyes, but he was shaking, sharp breaths coming out in heavy pants. This was the kid Dylan told me to kill as a mercy, him and Wendy. Instead, I held Ben tighter to me. "You're Roman's brother," I managed to get out in a whisper. "I can get you out of here." The boy didn't move for a moment, his jaw clenching, like he was trying to speak, before he stepped to the side. I started toward the door, and he brushed past me, muttering a mantra. I don't think I'd ever heard Peter Pan say that. Joining Wendy, the two of them disappeared down the tunnel, and I took my chance, pulling Ben back through the door and back out into the night. "Did you do it?" Dylan was waiting for me, and I told him the truth. I said I couldn't. He asked me if any of them said anything different, and I told them they were just muttering their usual lines. I think Dylan, despite being a pessimist, still thinks his friends are in there somewhere. I've brought Ben back home, and right now, he's resting on my couch. He hasn't spoken, but he's showing promise, clenching and unclenching his fist. There was a knock on the door earlier. I could see Dylan through my window. His knocks sound different, almost metallic. Tap, tap, tapping on my door. I don't understand what he wants. His friends didn't say anything out of place. I'm too scared to open the door. Is he going to take Ben away? Peter's lines, however, I don't fully remember them from the movies. When did he say this? First tunnel, rabbit hole, fairy dust, big red button. Even thinking about retelling this story has made me the most afraid I've ever been in my life. I suppose if I keep it bottled up, I'll go insane. God knows the security company isn't talking. I feel like if I don't warn people and they go there. Alright, if I'm telling the story then I'd better back up a bit. It started a little over a month ago. I work for a security firm that guards projects all over the country. I'm sort of a specialist. It seems like if there's some weird stuff happening at a site, I get called in. I'm not sure why. Maybe my ex-military background, or maybe the fact that, well, we'll get to that. This place up in New England was having some trouble. A local firm was remodeling an old church when workers suddenly started quitting. No one seemed to have a good reason why they didn't want to work there anymore. So guess who got the call to come in and straighten things out? Driving up there gave me the most profound feeling of being alone I've ever had. And mind you, I've sat watching caves, foxholes, ditches, some of the most god-forsaken places on the planet, all by my lonesome, and never did I ever feel as soul-crushingly alone as driving up that little 2-lane road that was the only sign of humanity, as the trees seemed to close in on me from every side. As unnerving as that was, it was nothing compared to pulling into the little town where the church was. It was like the nightmare scene from a B-horror movie. I guess arriving at night in the middle of a rainstorm didn't help. I pulled in beside the only vehicle I saw and ran inside the hotel that looked like a saloon out of an old western. I barely got the door closed until there was a light and a gun shoved in my face. "Who the hell are you?" said a man from somewhere behind the glare of a flashlight. "Jones," I said, slowly raising my hands. "I was called in to help out with your worker problem." The light lowered but the gun stayed. "What company do you work for?" "Sentinel Security." I saw the man relax a little, but mostly I was happy that he lowered the gun. In the best of times, a gun in a situation is less than ideal. All kinds of accidents can happen. I've seen many innocent bystanders fall victim to contagious gunfire. The man stepped over to a table and sat. As I looked around the room, I was surprised at how much it looked like a movie set from an old western, right down to the lit lanterns on the tables and hanging from the rafters. He beckoned me over and I sat across from him. "Judging by the welcome, I'm guessing the workers aren't the only ones who are spooked," I said. He looked at the gun, then laid it on the table. He seemed to be in his 40s or 50s, but there was a tiredness in his eyes. He looked weary and haggard. "Truth be told, I'm not even sure a gun would do any good. Maybe you should tell me when the trouble started." He looked at me and I could see worry tugging at his eyes. "Your contract's open, right?" I nodded. "Which means you have to finish the job or you don't get paid, right?" I nodded again. He looked me over for a long moment, then sat back, drained his glass of amber-colored liquid, and sighed. "I bought this town a while back," he started. "Recently, with the passing of my wife, I decided I needed to throw myself into a project to keep me busy. I wanted to revitalize this town and turn it into a tourist attraction. I'm sorry for your loss." He nodded in recognition, but never said another word about her. "Things were going along smoothly," he said. "The buildings you see have all been restored. They look good. You should have seen them when we started," he scoffed. "They were falling apart. No one had lived here for years. That's why I was able to buy the whole place for next to nothing. I'm thinking that's not the only reason." "Yes," he said as a haunted look passed through his eyes. "We saved the church for last because it needed the most work. But once they started remodeling is when things began to happen. It wasn't much at first. Shovels and saws would go missing. Tools would be left in fine order at night, only to be in complete disarray in the morning. For a while, the workers blamed each other, saying there was a prankster among them. But that wasn't the case. Oh, how I wish it was." I waited for a long moment for him to continue. "We found the first body shortly after that," he said so quietly I barely heard him. "Of a worker." He nodded. "Dead." He nodded again. "Why didn't you stop everything and leave?" "Because it was already too late," he said. "We had disturbed it." "Disturbed what?" He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He shook his head and looked away. For a moment I could swear I saw a tear run down his cheek. "I'm sorry," he said, rubbing his palms on his face. "Let me take you to your room and we'll discuss this further in the morning." My curiosity wanted him to finish the story, but it seemed like his weariness had been amplified by alcohol. I followed him as he carried the lantern up the stairs to the first door and opened it for me. He handed me the light and told me the bathroom was across the hall if I needed it. "I'll be here bright and early in the morning to give you the dollar tour," he said, sounding more like a host. "Aren't you staying here tonight?" His eyes flashed genuine fear. "Not here," he said. "I'll be back in the morning." I looked around the comfortable-looking room trying to decide what was so wrong with it as he stepped to the door. "Oh, by the way," he said, stopping at the doorway, "don't bother with your cell phone. There's no signal up here." I glanced down at my phone and when I looked up, he was gone. I picked up the lantern and stepped to the doorway, but I didn't hear him leaving. You would have thought someone walking out on a hardwood floor would make some noise, but it was silent. The only noise I heard was the rain pelting against the windows. Since I was already in the hallway, I decided to check out the bathroom. I walked a short distance down the hall and found it to be functional and clean, but nothing extraordinary. While I was there, I used the toilet and washed my hands, then went to my room and got my toiletries kit to brush my teeth. Carrying a lantern around was a little disconcerting. I've had to deal without electricity many times before, but that wasn't what was bothering me. The shadows from the lamp danced all over over, giving the impression of others in the room with me. It's strange because I've never had that feeling before. Shadows were always just shadows. I was trained to be cautious of who could be hiding in the shadows, not the shadows themselves. I finished up my bedtime routine and settled into sleep. There wasn't much of anything else to do, so might as well get some rest. One of the things I was taught early on in my career was that anytime you get a chance, rest. You never know when the next chance will come. I laid down on the comfortable bed and did some relaxation exercises. Before I knew it, I was asleep. I woke with a start, not knowing why. It was pitch black in the room. Instead of panicking, I touched my watch to illuminate it and found my phone. Turning on the flashlight and lighting the lamp helped me to get my bearings, but still didn't tell me why I was awake. I sat there for a long moment, then I heard it. There was a loud clanking sound coming from somewhere outside. Sleeping in my clothes when on a job was a habit I'd gotten into when I first started doing private security, another carryover from the military. I slipped out of bed and into my boots, then strapped on my utility belt and checked to make sure my sidearm was loaded. I turned off the phone's flashlight and grabbed a small utility flashlight from one of the pouches on the belt. For the moment, I holstered the gun and explored with the flashlight. This could be nothing. I didn't want to go in gangbusters just to find some kids playing around or a worker came in early. I double-checked my watch. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. Seemed like an odd time for a worker to come in, but stranger things have happened. Working my way down the stairs quietly, I double-checked the bar room. It was empty. Opening the door, I had the strangest feeling that something was wrong. Nothing seemed to be out of place. It had stopped raining, and I stepped out into the street to find a light layer of fog. Looking up and down the street, I heard the noise again. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of the church. Leading with the flashlight, I started in that direction. There seemed to be a slight orange glow coming from inside the building the closer I got. The beam of my flashlight made the air around me glow. It made me feel like I was giving my position away. I fought back the feeling. This was a little town in Vermont, not an active war zone. I had to be cautious, but also temperate, with non-lethal actions. The church loomed in front of me. It seemed much larger up close. I climbed the steps and reached for the doorknob when a loud crack sounded behind me. I whipped around, shining my flashlight at everything, but there was nothing there. As I was looking back, I noticed a light in the window of my room. I must have left the lantern lit. As I looked, I saw the light dim for an instant and then get brighter, almost as if someone had walked in front of it. The temperature felt like it was in the lower 70s, but that didn't keep a chill from running down my spine. Someone was curious to know who I was. From years of experience, I've found that it's never good if someone wants to find out who you are, but doesn't want to do it face to face. That would be something to deal with when I got back to my room. For now, there was a church to explore. I got the feeling that someone was trying to distract me from entering the church. I reached the top of the stairs and turned the knob, but nothing happened. It didn't feel like it was locked. It was almost as if someone was on the other side, holding the knob. I turned as hard as I could, and finally it gave and the door opened, dragging me inside and nearly knocking me to the floor. Regaining my balance, my hand hovered over my gun, expecting to see someone doing something they weren't supposed to. As I slowly panned around the room, I found something much worse. Absolutely nothing. There was a lit lantern set up on a table near the altar that was in the middle of being restored. Other than that, there were a lot of pews that were halfway constructed. The ones that were finished looked like they had been sanded and were waiting for a layer of stain. I walked down the center aisle as if looking for a seat at a wedding or a funeral. As I approached the partially reconstructed pulpit, I looked up and saw a life-size wooden carving of Jesus on the cross. It looked old. Not like wine that ages well, but like decrepit. It had been painted flesh colors at one time, but now it was cracked and peeling away from the carving. It looked grotesque to see layers of skin peeling away like it was rotting off his body. I'm not the most religious man, but I believe in Jesus. I've prayed enough prayers sitting in foxholes and caves, asking to be rescued from bad situations, and I'm still here. I wouldn't call us best buds. I know our relationship could be closer, but seeing him that way, rotting to pieces, was just disturbing. As I looked into his face, I swore I saw his eyes open for an instant. I blinked my own eyes to be sure I was seeing right, but when I looked again, they were closed. It was my imagination playing tricks on me. At least that's what I told myself as I stepped onto the platform and looked around. Off to each side were doors. I went to the one to the right and found a small broom closet. The one on the left held a set of stairs that went down and disappeared into darkness. Just inside the door, there was yellow and black caution tape blocking the way down. I shined the light on the stairs and they looked sturdy enough. I reached for the tape, but before I got a hold of it, a strong hand grabbed my shoulder and turned me around. "What do you think you're doing?" said a man who was a full foot shorter than me, but his grip felt like iron. "I was about to go down those stairs," I said. He looked at me with the incredulous look a parent gave a toddler who was reaching for a hot stove. "And you didn't see the caution tape?" He said. "I saw it." "Who are you anyway? I've never seen you before." "Jones," I said, offering my hand. "I'm with Sentinel Security. I was called in to investigate why workers keep quitting." He looked at my hand, then at me. "So this investigation includes ignoring obvious warnings." My hand was still extended but had yet to be shaken. I let it fall back to my side. "Are you a worker or a foreman?" He scoffed. "Nothing so formal. I make sure people do what needs to be done." "So, foreman." His eyes bled with suspicion as he stared at me. "Where did you say you were from again?" As I was about to answer, more workers entered, followed by the owner I'd met last night. "Let's ask the boss if he knows you," the foreman said smugly. The owner locked eyes with me and gave me the strangest look as he walked up to us. "Good morning," he said, addressing both of us. "Good morning, sir," the foreman said. "I caught this man snooping around in here. Did you know?" he said. "Is that true?" "I wasn't snooping, I was investigating," I said. "Don't you remember our conversation last night?" His eyes opened a hair wider for an instant, then went back to normal. "Of course I do," he said with a smile that seemed forced. "Remind me again, my memory isn't the best." "We met in the saloon, talked for a little bit, and then you showed me to my room." "Indeed," he said with a raised eyebrow. "Did I say anything else?" "You told me you bought this place after your wife passed away, and problems started after you found the first dead worker." "Dead?" the foreman said with alarm. "When did this happen?" The owner burst into laughter. "It appears Mr. Jones here has pulled a fast one on you," he said to the foreman. "Perhaps he and I should go and discuss the matter in private, and you can continue with your work." The owner grabbed my arm and guided me away from the foreman, whose eyes burned as they followed us out the door. We walked out of the church in silence as he nodded to workers who were straggling in to start work for the day. He led me back to the saloon and we sat at the same table as before. "So you and I met in this saloon last night?" he said. "At this very table," I said. "I came to the door and you pulled a gun on me." His eyebrows raised. "Did I now? And what time was this?" "I'd say around 9. We sat here and talked about what was going on with the workers." "And what else did I say other than about the worker?" "I asked why you hadn't left and you said it was too late." This time he didn't try to hide it. His eyes grew wide. He stared at me for a long moment, then seemed to gather himself. "I apologize, Mr. Jones, if this all seems a little strange," he said. "You and I did not have a conversation last night." It was my turn to raise my eyebrows. "At 9 o'clock last night, I was in bed with my very much alive wife." "But," you said, "and we have not had any workers die." "I don't understand." "Neither do I." I thought about it for a long moment. "You were drinking when you talked to me. Is it possible you were too drunk to remember?" He leaned a little closer. "I haven't had a drink in 19 years. He reached into his pocket and set a coin on the table. I picked it up and looked at it. It was an AA coin. "Then who did I talk to last night?" He put the coin back in his pocket. "Are you sure it was me who was drinking?" I looked up at him and read suspicion in his eyes. "I don't drink." He leaned back in his chair. "It seems we've reached an impasse," he said. "Perhaps I should call your company and have a different person come and investigate the matter. I wanted to find out what was going on. Perhaps you should give me at least a day to investigate," I said. "Unless there's some other reason you don't want me to get to the bottom of this." He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Please continue your investigation, Mr. Jones," he said, unimpeded. "I will inform the foreman to allow you free rein." "Thank you," I said, standing to leave. "Just one more thing," he said. "What was the last part of what my doppelganger told you?" "You said it was too late to leave because you had disturbed something." His eyes fell to the table as if deep in thought. I went back to the church and began talking to the workers one by one. Each of them was hesitant to talk around the foreman, but once they were out of earshot, told very similar stories. There had been strange things going on, especially at night. It was more than just tools being moved around. Strange symbols would appear carved into the wood they were using. The owner would tell them to cut the symbols out and use whatever they could of the wood. One of the workers had gone missing, but after a day or so, the owner said he had quit. The strange thing was no one was able to contact him after that. The more I dug, the more I found. Some of the workers had become curious as to why they were restoring this town in the middle of nowhere. It turned out it had been long suspected that satanic rituals were carried out in this very church. It was also suspected to be the site of one of the earliest witch burnings. But the two facts that stuck out in my mind were no one hung around after dark. That was when things were alleged to get strange, and no one was allowed down the steps I had found before the foreman stopped me. The workers had been told the steps were unsafe and could collapse under the weight of a person. It didn't take much convincing to keep them away from the creepy stairs. By afternoon, I knew exactly what my next move was. I went back to my room and checked around to see if anything was missing. Nothing seemed to be, so I set my watch and took a nap. The alarm went off at 9 o'clock. I went to the bathroom to splash some water on my face, then geared up for my expedition. When I got to the church, it was empty. I made a beeline for the left door and the creepy staircase. With flashlights attached to a headband and my waistband, I was good to go to keep my hands free for whatever I might need them for. I attached a safety rope like mountain climbers do and found a sturdy spot to anchor it into the wall. If the stairs gave out on me, at least I wouldn't fall. As advertised, every stair creaked like it was about to give out, but thankfully none of them did. The trip down was an assault on the senses. The damp, musty smell of rotting wood and general decay was nearly overwhelming. I was surprised at the general lack of cobwebs. It told me this area wasn't quite as off limits as some had let on. Surprisingly, the bottom didn't open up into a full basement. There were a few wooden shelves at the base of the stairs, but they were empty. Instead, it became a narrow passageway. The floor was made of dirt and the walls were the same stone the foundation of the church was made from. It seemed whoever had built this tunnel built it at the same time as the church. The ceiling barely made it to 6 feet. I had to duck to keep from brushing my head against it. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but this was the key to discovering what was happening here. I'd been walking for 10 minutes. Senses alert, hand on my holstered sidearm. Suddenly the air changed. The smell became more pungent and the air warmer. There was a feeling of closing in that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I turned a corner and the tunnel opened up into a large room with a high ceiling. I panned around trying to get the scope of the room when my light fell on something big in the corner. It looked like a massive black boulder that was made of leather. Watching, transfixed, I noticed it was moving. Not much, but just a bit rising and falling. I realized it was breathing. Fear gripped me. I no longer had any interest in finding out what was going on here. I just wanted to turn and slowly back away. The thing made a noise. It was a snort or a cough, but in either case, it seemed to be waking up. I doused my lights and stayed as still as possible while listening in the total darkness. Its breathing became louder and less steady. I heard a creaking that sounded like bones when someone stretched. It was getting up, and I was standing in the middle of the tunnel. If by some miracle it didn't already know I was here, as soon as it walked over here it would run right into me. My mind raced to come up with options as I heard footsteps coming closer. I backed up against the wall and started edging to the left, hoping I was in the main room and not still in the tunnel. The footsteps were so close when they suddenly stopped. The absence of sound was deafening. I tried to hold my breath as I listened for the beast's breathing. It was slow and sporadic as if it was listening for me. Neither of us moved. We barely breathed, each waiting for the other to reveal their location. My hand drifted to the gun as I tried to pull it out of the holster as quietly as possible. The air shifted. The beast had moved, but I didn't know where. I heard a strange squelching sound, and then, "What are you doing, Mr. Jones?" I tried to hold off as long as possible, but curiosity got the best of me. I turned on my headlamp to find the owner standing right in front of me, staring at me with a maddening smile. My eyes darted around looking for the beast, but I knew I wouldn't find it. It was standing in front of me. "So are you the real thing?" I said, hoping to keep the panic out of my voice. "Or are you some shapeshifter who pretends to be someone else because he has no identity of his own?" "I am whoever I want to be," he said. I heard the squelching again, only this time I had the displeasure of watching it happen. His entire body rippled and tore itself apart. only to reform into the beast for a moment, then tear apart again and reform into something much more terrifying. I gasped, looking into my own eyes. "You see," he said in my voice, "I can take your place and travel around pretending to solve problems." While he was changing, I glanced around to see if there was anything else in the room I could use. In the far corner, I saw what looked like a nest and an inverted cross hanging on the wall. "If you could, why haven't you?" I said, playing a hunch. "What? If you were free to go anywhere, then why haven't you? Why sit here in the middle of the woods with nothing to do?" "I choose to stay here," he said in my voice. "You choose because this is where your power is. You know so little. I'm rebuilding this place so my worshippers can live here and pray to me, giving me all the power I need, just like when this place was first built. And until my followers thrive, I survive off of human sacrifice. So you did kill the worker, and no one remembers him, just like they won't remember you." He grinned and took a step toward me, but I drew my pistol and shot him in the forehead. He fell to the ground, bleeding. It was a strange sight to watch myself die, but then the squelching began again, and he reformed into his demonic form. He stood 10 feet tall and covered in leathery skin that looked like tiny teeth. His face was a nightmare of glowing red eyes and massive sharp teeth. He roared at me in what sounded like 1,000 voices. I turned and ran down the tunnel, ducking so I didn't hit my head and knock myself out. That would have ended my escape in my life. I heard the squelching again and heard my voice call after me. "You can't escape, and besides I know how to find you." I turned and fired, hitting him in the chest. He dropped and squelched again. I wanted to watch him turn into his demon form to see him squashed into the tunnel. That was too small for him, but I didn't dare squander this time for anything but escape. It seemed like forever until I came to the stairs. I took them 2 at a time. Once I reached the top, I turned to see him at the bottom. I shot him again, then found a lantern inside the church, lit it, and tossed it down the stairs. The glass shattered, spreading fire all over the bottom stairs. They began to burn almost immediately. I could hear his desperate cries as the flames crawled up the stairs, destroying them one by one. Turning and running out the doors, I didn't bother with my things in my room. I hopped in my car and drove like a bat out of, well, you know. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I glanced in my rearview mirror, hoping I wouldn't see that thing chasing me. Instead, I saw a glow growing in the forest behind me. I prayed the whole church was on fire and it would spread to all the houses. I only wished his followers were in the houses when they burned. I wondered how many more places there were like this in the world. Thank you to my superfans, Sweet Black Swan, Tacy, and Brooklyn. I really appreciate you guys supporting my channel, and I look forward to making more content for everyone.